happy Saturday. Today we're going to read from No Hope Beyond This Point again, going back to horror after doing illustrations last week. And the story we're going to read today is called Out to Sea. I felt that would be a fun one for me to do as far as trying to find creaking ship noises and maybe some ambient music for the background. Anyways, tell me what you think. Okay. Out to sea. How long was he going to stay in here? How long could he? His food supply was running dangerously low, and if he ever wanted to get to land, he would have to steer. The maritime dream had been out to sea for over a month when the trouble started. Alan had no idea what disease had plagued the vessel and its crew. He managed to escape it, but only because he had stayed holed up in his cabin. He didn't even know if there were still survivors. He had heard soft moans and whimpers when he'd risked opening his door 2 days ago, but there had been no footfalls to indicate any crew walking around since. Alan had booked passage on the merchant ship, but only as a passenger. He did not know how to run the vessel, but if he was to live, it looked as if he would have to chance it. Rising from the confines of his bed, he went to the door. Alan unlocked it and opened it only a crack. He pressed his ear to the opening before he thought it safe to step out. The stench that hit him was overwhelming. Nausea quickly rose. He fought to keep the bile down. Alan tore a piece of cloth off of his shirt and pressed it against his nose. He leaned on the wall until he could walk without feeling faint. Bodies lay in the corridor, some half out of the rooms. He did his best to keep his eyes straight ahead while he carefully picked his way around the corpses. The last time he had been down this hall was when he had smuggled food and drink to his room, and had barricaded himself inside. Many had still been alive then, but he had felt they would not be for long. They were fighting a losing battle. The sick had laid in their cots, gasping for air and clawing at their skin, saying it burnt them. Alan hadn't wanted to fall victim. The disease had terrified him, so he'd hid. And now, it seemed, he was the only one left. When he finally made it to the upper deck, he shoved the door open and inhaled a deep breath. The sea air stung, but was refreshing. He pushed the door closed behind him. Leaning against it, Alan shut his eyes tight, as if that could force the images of the dead away. After a few moments, he moved away from the door and took in his surroundings. A few dead men lay on the deck, but the sky looked clear enough. He didn't have a plan to deal with an impending storm, as he knew very little about sailing. Instead, he focused on tasks he could do. Alan began rolling the bodies on the deck overboard. He didn't want to have to stare at them until he found land, as well as worry about any lingering contagion that might still affect him. With that job done, he headed into the captain's room and looked for anything he could use to board up the door leading below. He couldn't stand to think about the state those corpses were in, and hoped that blocking the door might block the thought of them. Once Alan was satisfied that the door was sealed, he moved any food and drink he could find from the captain's quarters to the helm. He used 2 belts lashed together to hold himself to the wheel, vowing to never completely let go until he was saved. Days passed with Alan eating little and sleeping even less. The wind and waves kept the vessel moving, but there had been no sighting of any land. Exhaustion and worry were starting to take their toll. During the night, Alan thought he heard someone shuffling around on the deck with him, but had not seen anyone. He tried to convince himself it was the spray from the ocean causing the noise, but wasn't so sure. That afternoon, as Alan started to nod off, the doorknob to the lower decks began to rattle. His head shot up and he looked at it. Nothing further happened, and he turned back around to watch the ocean in front of the bow. An hour or 2 passed before he heard it again. No one is alive, right? They've all surely perished, he thought. The sound of the knob being twisted and hands clawing at the wood forced him to turn and look at the door again. This time, he saw the doorknob slowly rotate, but the boards held tight. His eyes were wide with fright, and he felt sweat gather on his brow. Were there indeed survivors? Did I lock them down there? Alan strained his ears, but the noises had stopped. "Hello?" he yelled. He waited, but there was no reply. He faced forward again and undid the belts, holding him upright. Once free, he stumbled and swayed, but eventually made his way to the door. "Hello," he called again. He pressed his head against the wood and listened intently. There was no sound save for the waves hitting the ship. He knocked on the door and shouted again. Nothing. With uncertainty stamped across his face, Alan returned to the helm and bound himself to the wheel. He placed his hands upon it and continued his mission. "If someone is alive, the best I can do is get us to land," he told himself. Night fell and Alan dozed. The belts held him upright, but nightmares plagued his dreams. He heard whispers all around him calling him a coward. But what was he to do? He was no physician. How was he to help the sick and dying? The voices didn't care. They followed him as he ran from them in his dream. He woke with a start, his heart hammering in his chest. He looked around in the dark but couldn't figure out what had awoken him. As he drifted back off, he heard it again. Fingernails scraping on wood. Alan glanced at the lower deck door and heard someone moan in pain. A moment passed, and he could smell death in the air. Turning his head away, he pressed a hand over his mouth and nose to block out the stench, but it didn't help. He heard someone thump against the wood. One of the boards clattered to the ground behind him. He whipped his head around again to stare at the door in the gloom. It shook as someone struck it again, causing another board to fall. Alan gripped the wheel tightly and looked out over the sea. "I'm trying to get us to safety," he screamed. His confession seemed to make no difference. Another thump and another board down. The doorknob rattled and Alan heard the squeak of hinges. With wide eyes, he looked back. The door was open, but no one was there. He glanced left and right but saw no one, until he turned back around. Dozens of crew members stood at the bow facing him, their faces bloody and covered in sores, their clothes tattered and ruined. They closed in around Alan, glaring at him. "I'm trying to save us," he yelled again, panic in his voice. The crew said nothing, but one produced a knife and used it to cut the belts holding Alan to the wheel. Alan shrieked and tried to back away, but his tired legs gave out and he landed on the deck. He scuttled backwards away from the crowd. They moved in closer and closer as he shifted away. As soon as he crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut, trapping him below with the dead. He screamed in the dark and beat on the door, but no one came to save him. Hands reached out from behind, gripping him tightly, and pulled him further into the bowels of the ship. Morning came, and it brought the sight of land with it. A few hours later, the maritime dream ran aground. By mid-afternoon, a salvage and rescue operation was underway to see what could be done about the ship and its crew. They found no survivors and only dead bodies below deck, save for one corpse that was still lashed to the wheel. I hope you enjoyed that. Poor Alan did not make it out. This one actually was, I believe, like a dream that I had, and I wrote it down when I woke up. I think I did this one when I was probably a late teen, and just kept it in a drawer, and one day pulled it out, brushed it off, and now it's published, so yay. Anyways, again, I hope that you enjoyed it. Let me know what you thought about it and the sound effects that I used, and I'll see you again in 2 weeks.